Basically, before I start, I'll tell you a little bit about what nanotechnology is, or what nano is. So nano just means small, and small is, in this case, very small. So, I'm sorry. Can I try it without it, maybe? If I try without it, can you hear me at all?
Yeah.
You can? Okay. Well, I'll stand up and I'll talk loud, because, okay. So nano basically means small. Very small in this case, so we're talking 1 billion times smaller than a millimeter. So, and I've thought about this long and hard, and I can give you all sorts of examples of small. So for example, I'm 1.7 meters. One of my fingers is about 1 centimeter. If you think about a raindrop, that's about 1.5 millimeters. So now we're going down in orders of magnitude. A bacteria, which you can't see, and you'll need a microscope to see, is about what's called 2 microns. So that's another couple of orders of magnitude down. And then nano is down further again. So it's 10 to the minus 9 meters is a nanometer. So I still, as a scientist, find that hard to imagine. I can scale up, but I can't scale down easily. So then I did a little experiment for myself, being a scientist. Experiments is what it's all about. I took my iPod Nano, and I said, if this was nano, how big would the iPod have to be in scale? So the smallest dimension of my iPod Nano is 0.68 centimeters. So in order for the nano, or for the regular iPod to be in scale, it would have to be 9 orders of magnitude larger. So I thought about that, and I said, well, what about my plasma, my 42-inch plasma TV screen? Would I be having to carry that around with me if that was my iPod? No, that's not. That's only, I think, 2 orders of magnitude. So then I thought, well, what about iMac screen? Could I carry that around with me? 4 orders of magnitude. We're still nowhere near the level we need to be. Empire State Building, 5 orders of magnitude. When I worked it out, it would actually be the distance from London to New York is how big the iPod would have to be for my iPod Nano to be really nanoscale in comparison. So that gives you a sense of how small we're going here. So then what is a nanomaterial is the next thing I want to just tell you about before I get into some applications. Nanomaterials can be anything with a dimension in nano. So it can be a nanoparticle, which would be a spherical particle. It can be a nanorod, a nanowire. It can be a surface that has just nanopatterning or nanostructuring. It can be an array of particles. It can be a material that has nanoparticles put into it. So this is what we call like a composite material. And an example of this that you might all have come across is that now the rubber tires on your car are strengthened by having carbon nanotubes in them. So that's an example of a composite nanomaterial. And then, so in as many different forms as you can think of for nano shapes and nanostructures, there's also that many different materials. So for example, a nanoparticle composed of silver is not the same as a nanoparticle composed of gold, not the same as a nanoparticle composed of carbon, for example, not the same as a nanoparticle composed of a polymeric material, something like polystyrene or your plastic cups. So to talk about nanotechnology or nanoparticles, it's so generic and so broad that it leads to all sorts of complications because, for example, I can tell you about one nanoparticle that's designed for use in medicine, and it has an important therapeutic application and you want it in your body because it's doing something useful. Or I can tell you about a different nanoparticle that's designed, for example, to strengthen your car tires. That one you don't want in your body. You don't want to accidentally be exposed to that. So because the materials are so different and because the uses of them are so different, there's both what we would call the positive aspects of nanotechnology and also the potential risks associated with nanotechnology. And the research that we're doing in our lab is looking at both. So as we're developing applications, we're also assessing the safety and the potential risks. So the ones that I'm going to talk to you today about are mostly in the environment because that was what I was asked to talk about. But we also work with many different applications for medicine. For example, one popular example is gold nanoparticles, which are being used to target specifically cancer cells and to treat those specifically, leaving the cells that are healthy alone. Another example that we work with is sort of in the IT industry, the information technology, that's your mobile phones, your computers, everything else. There, a lot of the work is using very, very small particles because they conduct electrons faster, so that you can get your technologies, your computers work faster, your mobile phones work faster because of the use of nanotechnology. So the point really is that nanomaterials and nanoparticles have some very different properties, and these are what makes the area of nanotechnology so exciting and so useful. So some of the main properties of interest for applications of nano are the small size, which means that they can go to new places in the body. That's, for example, nanomedicine. Again, the small size means that they conduct, for example, they conduct faster, they're stronger, they're lighter, which means there are a lot of uses in materials. And finally, their very small size means they have a larger surface area. So as things get smaller, the ratio between the volume of it, which is the whole lot, and the surface area increases. So the smaller something gets, the more surface area it has. And what this means is that if you have anything that happens at your surface, so any kind of a reaction, like any kind of a process that happens at the surface, the more surface area you have, the more efficient that reaction is. So one of the examples where nanotechnology is being considered a lot in the environment is for green energy. So this is renewable energies or energies that don't involve the burning of fossil fuels. So again, for example, something called titanium dioxide, which is a very common material. We eat it, it's used, it's what gives icing sugar the white color. It's also used in sunscreens. So it already has a lot of uses, but in its nano form now, people are using it to coat surfaces. And one of the things it can do is capture energy. So, or well, convert energy. And then the reaction is catalyzed at the surface. So the more surface area you have, the more efficient your energy conversion is, and therefore the more efficiently your green energies work. So many buildings, for example, in China and Japan are already using coatings from nanotitanium dioxide on windows. And you know, all of the modern skyscrapers in Japan and China, full of windows, nightmare to clean if there's, 117 stories. So they're designing these coatings that, because they have, again, this sort of nano surface structuring, they actually are what's called self-cleaning. And what basically this means is that instead of water droplets sticking and running slowly down and creating streaks all down the window, the surface is such that the water actually just wets it properly. So instead of forming these little hydrophobic droplets that you see, it actually wets it. And then it just, so the whole sheet just slides down and you don't get the same streaky, dirty windows. And another advantage, so they're self-cleaning, which means you're using less detergents, you're using less energy, you're using less of these cranes to go up and clean your super windows. But also then they convert energy, and the energy can be converted into heat, which is then used to heat the buildings. So there's a lot of really excellent technologies that are being adapted. And currently Japan and China are leading the way in terms of getting these applications from the lab to everyday use. So that's just one example, is energy conversion and self-cleaning windows. Another example that's really important is water purification. So again, remember the exact number, I have it here, sorry. Something like 80% of the Earth is covered by salt water. So even though we all have there is loads of water on the Earth, it's not drinkable. So yeah, 80% of the Earth is covered by salt water. So, and then and a large population of the Earth, 1.1 billion people don't have access to clean drinking water. So we have 80% of the Earth covered by salt water, large numbers of people who don't have access to clean water. Can we convert our salt water into drinkable water? Yes, we can. Nanotechnology also plays a role here. So what you need to do is you have salt water, you need a way of separating out the water and leaving the salt behind. So what we do is something called nanofiltration. And the way this works is that you have what's called a semi-permeable barrier. So it's permeable to some things and impermeable to others. So in this case, the pores are nano size, so they're very, very tiny in your filter, which means the water molecules can pass through, but the salt molecules can't. So what happens then is you put some pressure on the solution, the salts stay behind, the pure water comes out, and you end up with a much more concentrated salt solution and clean, potable water, drinkable water on the other side. So this is one of the very useful applications of nanotechnology for the environment. And this is currently in operation in large scale in countries like Australia. And it's starting to be used now in Florida and California and places like that. So again, an application that's starting to be out there, developing well, and a positive use of nanotechnology. Some other applications that I thought were interesting. I mentioned water purification, mentioned energy capture. Oh yeah, pollution remediation. That's another good one. So there's a lot of areas, for example, areas where there's been mining or where there's been large-scale industry that's been releasing effluent, war zones where there's lots of chemicals that have been put on the soil, all of these areas where you can't grow anything on the ground now because it's too chemically polluted. So one option is just to leave the ground waste for hundreds of years until the chemicals have leached into the soil and eventually gone far enough away that you can start to grow things again. Or another option is that you can try to remediate this soil, which basically means to take out the pollutants. So for examples of these sorts of pollutants would be heavy metals like lead, cadmium, chromium. I know there was a whole film about chromium 4 somethings, chromium 6 hexide or something, I don't remember. But so this was the same idea that these chemicals can leach out, and using nanoparticles, again, because of their large surface area. So again, you want something that binds these materials from the soil, captures them, and then you can recover them and take them out of the soil. So that's the sort of research that we do in our lab, not necessarily with binding of heavy metals, but with binding of various materials and, for example, proteins or other naturally occurring materials. So the sort of research that we're doing is looking at selectively binding certain materials using nanoparticles. So again, I said nanoparticles have a whole range of chemistries, a whole range of different materials. They can be functionalized. You can modify them to have certain properties or to have certain affinities, which means that they selectively bind one compound over another. So for example, wait till I think of a good example. Acid and base. You all know how a salt works, I assume, that there's a positive charge and a negative charge and they attract. So for example, many of the heavy metals would have a positive charge. So we can then design a nanoparticle that has a negative surface, which then will attract these positive pollutants, and we can then remove them from the solution. So this is used in, as I said, for remediation of soil, but nanotechnology is also now being used to clean up, for example, oil spills in water. So in the seawater, it can also be used for that. So environmental remediation is another very positive example. Also looking at existing structures and how we can repair them. So for example, there's a product on the market now called nanocrete, which is basically a concrete that contains some nanoparticles. The idea being that if you have, for example, a bridge or a wall and it starts to get little cracks, the cracks start to appear and then they expand because water enters the crack. When water freezes, it expands and that pushes the crack ever so slightly, bigger and bigger each time. Each freeze and thaw cycle increases the crack slightly until eventually you start to have your bridge collapsing, or you have the same applies to your windshield breaking or any other undesirable events for your buildings or your bridges. So the idea with repair of existing structures is that if you can inject something quite small, like a nanoparticle, into it, and then the particle has some property that it structures or it forms a glue, this can be used to repair the structure. So this nanocrete does that. It's a sort of a composite material, like I mentioned, so it has nanoparticles contained inside something else, and the something else is a sort of a resin that is activated, for example, by UV light, so by sunlight, for example, which means that it's a liquid when you inject it, then you apply the sunlight or heating or a blowtorch or whatever it is, and that causes the outer material, the polymeric material, to polymerize, to form a solid, and then you've basically sealed your crack. So that's another nice example of where nanotechnology can be used in the environment. What ones am I forgetting? The self-cleaning windows I told you about. repair of existing structures I've told you about. I already mentioned the tires. These are the so-called nano-composite materials where you're taking an existing material and adding a nanoparticle to the material to give it another property or a better property. So to make it stronger, to make it lighter. Actually, lighter is a good one. A lot of cars and airplanes now are using nano-composite materials because these properties, the molecular properties of nanomaterials and nanorods in particular is such that they're very strong, even though they're very small. So you end up having these much lighter materials than your traditional, what we would call a bulk material. So having given you a whole range of examples, what I'm going to tell you now is a little bit that what I mentioned at the start, that all of these properties of nanomaterials, and especially the ones related to the surface and the surface area, which means that they're very reactive, and the fact that they're so small and therefore they can go to new places. So these properties that make them so attractive for applications are the very same properties that could lead to potential harm. And therefore we need to think about that too. So the getting to new places is an important one because they're so small, even though they're typically made of materials that we deal with every day, like polystyrene, like titanium dioxide I mentioned. All of these materials we interact with every day, but we interact with them in a bulk form, which is like this. So I can sit here or I can hold this, and I know that that material is not going to enter into my skin. I'm not going to breathe it. Whereas when you make things so small that we can't see them, that we need not even a regular microscope, we can see them. We need something called an electron microscope where we can really go down into the sort of orders of magnitude that I mentioned for nanotechnology. So the research that we're also doing is looking to understand and to make sure that our nanoparticles that we're designing, especially ones for use in the environment where we're using them to do good, we have to make sure that they're not going to cause other problems, say 20 years down the line or 30 years down the line. So the small size means that they can get to new places, as I said, and this basically means that particles of less than what's called 100 nanometers can potentially enter cells. Doesn't mean they do, it doesn't mean they will, but they can. And that's the aim of nanomedicine, is to design ones that do this and that do this in a controlled way. But we're also trying to make sure that if, for example, I use nanoparticles to clean the soil beside an industry which has a river beside it, I need to make sure that if these particles are washed from the surface of the soil into the river, that they're not going to cause harm to the fish or to the algae or to whatever else is in the water. And then that they're not going to be the fish who have interacted with these particles are then not going to end up in the food chain. And this is not new for nanotechnology, I should say. This is the same for every chemical. So for example, pregnant women are encouraged not to eat shellfish because shellfish take up mercury, which mercury is in our water, but at concentrations that don't affect most of us. But there's the pregnant woman is more susceptible. So, or actually the growing baby is more susceptible. But so when I talk about nanosafety, this is not anything new. What's new about it is that as we're developing the technologies, we're also looking at the safety aspects. And that's, I think, the important message. So, and coming back then to safety and making sure we don't cause harm, the word toxicology is used a lot. Now, we don't use it, we use nanosafety, but there's a community of researchers who call it nanotoxicology. And the point with calling it toxicology is that everything is toxic at a certain point. If you drink enough water, it's toxic, because again, it changes the balance between your salt and water. I like to use the example of electricity. Electricity is really harmful, but we've learned to manage it. So you can't imagine your life without electricity now, but if you touch an exposed wire, you'll get electrocuted. So nanotechnology needs to be managed, and the way we manage it is to assess the safety as we're assessing the development of the technologies. So, how long have I been talking? Okay. Well, I mean, I can keep going ad infinitum, but maybe people have some questions or...
We normally take a break for about 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay.
Can ask questions.
So,
refresh their glasses.
yeah. Well, what I'll do is I'll just recap and say that I think I think personally nanotechnology is a very exciting area. I'm delighted to be in it, and I think it can do a lot for energy, it can do a lot for the environment, it can do a lot for conservation, it can do a lot for a lot of areas, and I believe very lucky to be able to work in it, and the group that I work in take the responsibility of developing the technologies and ensuring that they're developed safely very seriously. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, so we'll take a break for about 10 minutes. So, Port, so we'll reconvene, and if you have any questions to ask Iseult, then